Hello everybody, Tobias here to give you some more basic tips and tricks in Adobe Illustrator. So this video is going to be about using blends and lines and guides together to create interesting and unique custom grids. If you're familiar with the basic grid tools and stuff, grids and guides that Adobe Illustrator and Creative Suite tools come with, you're familiar with the rulers where you can just drag a guide out. And it might seem like you're kind of limited to just straight lines at 90 degrees. And, for a basic grid, that can be really helpful. So a lot of times we're kind of quickly customizing our grid. We've got our view show grid, our document grid. We can change the ratio of these things. But again, it's just a flat square grid. Not super interesting, but you can do a lot more with Adobe Illustrator because Adobe Illustrator allows you to turn any path into a guide and any guide into a path, vice versa. But you can also work with guides just like you can work with paths, which means you can use things like the blend tool to create interesting and unique grids. Now, whether you're going to use that as a guide grid or it's going to be actually part of your graphic, this is going to be a tutorial on the different things you can kind of do with guides and grids to help kind of bring some really interesting kind of looks to your Illustrator work without having to do things quite so manually as you might think. So I'm just going to turn off my document grid here. And let's say at a real basic, I want to just make a 12-column horizontal, or 12-column vertical grid for myself with guides, so I could say, well, I've got to figure out how 1900 divides by 12 and then drag out that many and snap it to point. You don't need to do that. Illustrator will do that completely for you. You just need a start and an end. This is where a blend fills in the gaps for you. So drag your two guides, beginning and the start, blend options, make sure you're using specified steps. This is going to put 10 more lines in between there, so a total of 12 columns. So we're going to go Object, Blend, Make, and there you go. You've got your instantly even column grid figured out for you. Of course, you can do that vertically as well, however many times you want to divide this way. Works exactly the same. Put a start grid and an end, start guide and end guide. Object, Blend, Make. This made a rectangular grid, but that might often work. Let's say you're doing a 12-column CSS layout and you want to kind of make graphics to that. That's a really quick way to fill in the blanks. Once you're done making a blend, if you want to work with it, because right now it is a blend, you do have to remember to expand. So hit the expand, objects and fills, yep. So it's going to create two groups of guides for you that you can then work with. Just remember that once you've done that, you can't go back and iterate up the number of steps. But anyways, once you kind of know what your guide looks like, that can be a real quick way to build custom basic rectangular or columnar grids or whatever you kind of need. But now we can get into other things, like another type of grid you might want is an isometric grid, so 30-degree angle grid. You could do that with a rectangular grid, but again, it's kind of hard to work out the ratio. It's not super intuitive. So we can just build ourselves our first vertical grid, Object, Blend, Make. I'm going to put a whole bunch more. I want a much finer grid than that. So let's go into our blend and go blend options. Now we're just going to hit the up key with this number selected to put as many in there as we want. Let's make it a nice 40-point grid. So we can now, with it selected, it's selected in our layers, right click, transform, rotate 30 degrees. You can see I've done this before. Make the other grid going the other way, transform, reflect on the vertical, and we want to hit copy. And there we go, we've got our nice flexible isometric grid that we can draw to, hide whatever, quick and easy. So that can be a really handy way of building that type of grid if you find yourself in a situation where you actually need to draw isometrics versus using stock. So that's one thing you can do. So another thing you can do is kind of like a pseudo perspective grid. And there's a couple of different things here about how blends work. So in this case, we're not going to start with a guide. We're just going to start with a path. So I'm going to draw my line. So pay attention here to where I started, because this makes a difference in how blends work. I start on the left, click. So that's that shape. I'm going to stop that one. Let's give it a line so we can see it. Actually, let's use swatches like we should. Okay, so that's that line. And we're going to draw another line now that starts, I'm going to start with it over here and drop to there. So I can now use a blend to fill in those lines. I'm just going to draw them like that. So it's kind of like a pseudo perspective grid. It doesn't have your perspective grids going this way. As far as I know, the only way to do that is using the actual perspective grid in Adobe Illustrator. But that's fine. You know, this is often all we need, is we just want to be kind of drawing like that, and we can kind of eyeball the difference, or we could intersect the shape by reflecting the blend again on the vertical. Hit copy. And you kind of got your intersecting lines there that can give you a little bit of that perspective grid, but generally it just sort of works on one side, and we're kind of using that to guide if we're like distorting text or whatever. And there's quite a few other ways you can do that. But once this is done, again, same thing, object. Now in this case, because we've got a blend made of shapes, we've got to expand that into shapes, into lines. And now we can go to View, Guides, Make Guides. So you can take any shape or path that you've drawn in Illustrator, however you've done it, and you can make it into a guide set, which is pretty cool. But here's one more thing about blends, is that you get a different result if you draw your starting and end points in different directions. So start there, end there, start a new one, start here, and then draw out to there. Now when I go and make a blend, it's done it like this, which is pretty cool. So we can increase some more steps. So you can kind of create those. You probably did a few of these back in the 90s with a ruler and pen and filled in all the colors, but you know, you can have fun with it like that. You can double click, okay. Double click in if you want to move the end point together to kind of make these things join. There you go. Kind of some cool perspective graphics that you can have some fun with. Now you can also start to do even more interesting looking things using curved lines. So same thing, if you draw it this way and then you start another curvy shape this way, and then you make a blend, and increase the number. You can kind of create this real interesting kind of warped spirograph type of thing. Again, this is all about where the starting and the end point is of the paths that you're blending from. So I'm going to double click in and kind of play around with where that goes, just to kind of intersect them more. Just grab the end of this anchor point until it kind of fills in the wave shape, the waveform wire, kind of wireframe sort of look. That's a nice thing about blends, is you can kind of adjust them real time like this to get some interesting effects. So a lot of this stuff, it's kind of almost like finding some happy accidents. But if you're trying to do these kind of perspective grids, using the blend tool can be really handy. But also you can turn this into a guide set as well by expanding it and then just making guides from it and then drawing your shapes. or whatever you kind of want to do. Like say you wanted to turn these into a checkerboard pattern. Expand. So now you've got all these intersecting paths. The path finder, using the divide tool, can make all those into little squares for you. So now you can start filling these shapes with black and white and kind of make that checkerboard sort of look. It hasn't gotten rid of all those shapes, but the divide tool now turned each of these into a little square. So that can be a really interesting way to quite quickly create stuff that looks a ton more complicated than it really is to make. And you can also use it to come up with some really creative ways to guide your drawings with very custom kind of guide sets. Like I don't necessarily know what I would do with this guide set, but just to go through the exercise. Kind of give myself this curved perspective. You know, it's not true perspective, but it's pretty convincing. Fine tune and rotate it around or whatever, but let's now expand that and then view guides make. And there you go. You've got your kind of 1980s perspective grid that you can now draw stuff on and had it follow that curvy look. So yeah, the blend tool combined with the make guides tool can really take your grid and guide making to another level, and you can have a lot of fun with it.